Sit down. You're just a nurse." The man who said it did not look up when he said it. He was already crouched in the aisle of Flight 414, sleeves of a $400 shirt pushed to the elbow, one hand pressed flat to the chest of the gray-haired passenger on the floor, and he flicked the words back over his shoulder the way you'd wave off a draft. The woman he said them to was already on her knees on the other side of the patient. She did not sit down. She did not even blink. She just kept two fingers on the side of the old man's throat, counting, and let the insult go past her like weather. He had no idea who he had just ordered to the back of the cabin. 306 souls rode that airplane somewhere over the black middle of the Atlantic, 38,000 feet above water so cold it would stop a heart in 4 minutes. On the carpet between seat rows 19 and 20, a dying man. Kneeling over him with the wrong idea and the loudest voice, a celebrated cardiologist with his name on a hospital wing. And across the body, a quiet woman in a charcoal sweater who had spent 11 years keeping people alive in places far worse than a pressurized cabin, who answered to a rank that no one on that plane had heard her say, and who had decided a long time ago that she would never be the one to say it first. She would let it be said for her. That is how it always happened. But that is the end of the first hour, and the story starts before the wheels ever left the ground. Her name was Maya Okafor, and she had asked for a window seat because she wanted to sleep. That was the whole plan. 7 hours and 40 minutes from one continent to another, a small pillow, a gray airline blanket, and the cold, dark glass to lean her head against. She had been awake for 31 hours. She had spent the last 6 of them in a conference hall with bad coffee and worse lighting, listening to people who had never been closer to a casualty than a slideshow explain how casualties should be managed. She had said almost nothing. She had taken 3 pages of notes, 2 of which were polite, and 1 of which she would never show anyone. Then she had taken a taxi to the airport, checked 1 hard-sided case, and folded herself into seat 27A with the particular efficiency of a person who has slept in worse places than an economy seat, and considered all of them a luxury. She was 41 years old. Her skin was the warm medium brown of the river country her grandmother came from, and her hair was cropped close to the skull, practical, threaded now with a few strands of gray at the temples that she had stopped pretending to mind. She had a lean, careful build, the kind that came from work and not from a gym, and dark, steady eyes that took in a room the way other people read the first line of a book, quickly and then again, slower. She wore a plain charcoal crew neck sweater over a collared shirt, dark trousers, low boots she could run in. There was nothing about her that asked to be looked at. That was deliberate, too. In the breast pocket of her shirt, under the sweater, she carried a small brass coin worn smooth at the edges. On one face there was a nightingale, the little bird stamped in low relief, half rubbed away by 11 years of thumbs, hers and others. The other face was blank. It had been blank when they gave it to her, in a tent that smelled of canvas and antiseptic, and a man with 3 days of beard and a voice like gravel had pressed it into her palm and said, "We don't put the words on it. You already know the words." She did not take it out on airplanes. She kept her thumb against it through the cotton sometimes when she was tired, the way some people touch a wedding ring. She was touching it now. The man in the aisle seat beside her, 27C, was an older gentleman in a soft gray cardigan, with thinning hair combed carefully sideways and reading glasses he kept losing and finding again on the cord around his neck. He had a paperback novel, a thick one, a thriller with a foil title, and a small leather case of pills he set on his tray table with the unembarrassed routine of a man who had made friends with his own medications a long time ago. He had nodded to her when she sat down. She had nodded back. That, she had assumed, would be the extent of their relationship. She was wrong about that, but not in the way she expected. His name, she would learn, was Harlan Mercer. He was 71 years old. He was flying home from burying his older brother, and in about 5 hours he was going to nearly die at her feet. The boarding had the ordinary chaos of a full flight. Roller bags wedged into bins a half-inch too small. A toddler 3 rows up testing the acoustics of the fuselage. A flight attendant, young, neat, with a name tag that read Thuy, and a smile that had not yet learned to be tired, moving down the aisle, clicking bins shut, and saying, "Excuse me, sir?" "Excuse me, ma'am," in the patient sing-song of someone who said it 400 times a day. And then there was the man in seat 2A, up in the wide leather seats, who boarded last and loudest. Maya did not see him then. She only heard him, the way the whole cabin heard him, a polished, carrying voice complaining that his preferred sparkling water was not stocked, that the seat had been reclined by the previous occupant, that he had a panel at 8 tomorrow morning and could not afford to arrive looking like he'd slept in a tube. The flight attendants up front said, of course, "Sir," and right away, "Sir," in voices gone careful. Somebody chuckled. Somebody else didn't. Maya filed the voice away without a face attached to it and went back to the window. His name was Dr. Preston Vance. He was 58, silver-haired, with the deep, even tan of a man who golfed in winter, and his face was on the cover of a book in 3 airport shops in the terminal they had just left. He was a cardiologist of genuine and considerable skill. He had stood in operating rooms and put his hands inside the chests of people who would have died without him and brought them back hundreds of times, and he had earned the right to be proud of that. The trouble with Dr. Vance was not that his pride was unearned. The trouble was that he had let it grow over his judgment like ivy over a window until he could no longer tell the difference between what he could see and what he assumed. He had a watch worth more than the old man in 27C's car. He would tell you the brand if you gave him an opening. He believed, with the unexamined certainty of a man who had never once been the least important person in a room, that competence wore a uniform he would recognize on sight. He was about to learn that it does not. He was going to learn it slowly and in front of 300 people, and Maya was going to be the one who taught him without saying a single unkind word. But that, too, was hours away. There was one small moment during boarding that nobody noticed and that mattered more than anyone could have known at the time. A boy of about 9, 3 rows up, started a nosebleed. The dry, pressurized air and an anxious first flight, and his mother went straight to panic, dabbing at it with a cocktail napkin and making it worse, tipping the boy's head back the way frightened people always do. Maya was up before she had decided to be. She didn't take over. She crouched at the aisle and said low, just to the mother, "Lean him forward, not back. Back sends it down his throat and he'll be sick. Pinch the soft part here, not the bridge. 10 minutes by the clock. Don't peek." She handed her a fresh napkin from her own seat pocket. "He's fine. It's just the air. First time flying?" The boy nodded, mortified. "Mine too, once," Maya said. "And I threw up on a colonel, so you're already doing better than me." The boy almost laughed, which loosened the panic out of the whole row, and the bleeding stopped in 9 minutes because she'd told the mother exactly how long to hold, and the mother had held. Mr. Mercer, watching from beside her as she settled back into 27A, said mildly, "You did that like you've done it before." "A few times," Maya said. "Nurse?" "Something like that." She pulled the gray blanket up and looked out the window, which was her polite way of closing a door, and Mr. Mercer, who was a courteous man, let it close. He noticed one thing, though, before he went back to his thriller, the way she'd said colonel. Not the way you say a stranger's rank, the way you say a name. He didn't think anything of it. People say all sorts of things. He filed it away the way you file away a face you can't place and forgot it, and would not remember it again until a man in a 4-stripe uniform said the same word over the body Mr. Mercer was lying on, 5 hours and one ocean later, and the whole sentence finally made sense. That was the thing about Maya Okafor. The clues were always there. She never hid them exactly. She just never explained them, and people are very good at not seeing what they aren't looking for. She had thrown up on a colonel because she had been 19 and terrified in the back of an aircraft on her first real flight into a place she could not name, and the colonel had laughed and handed her a rag and told her she'd be fine, and she had been, and 22 years later she was the colonel, and the wheel had come all the way around. None of the 300 people on Flight 414 knew any of that. They only knew, the ones near row 27, that the woman in the gray sweater had stopped a child's nosebleed with 4 sentences and a borrowed napkin, and had been kind about it, and had not made a thing of herself. That was the first crack. Nobody saw it for what it was. They never do. The doors closed, the safety briefing played. Tui and the other attendants walked the aisle checking belts, and Tui paused at row 27 to make sure Mr. Mercer's tray table was stowed, and Mr. Mercer thanked her by name because he had read the name tag and was the kind of man who used people's names. Maya watched that small courtesy and revised her estimate of her seatmate upward. The engines spooled. The plane shoved itself off the earth and climbed into the dark, and the lights of the coastline tilted and slid away beneath the wing, and then there was nothing under them but black water and the long night. Maya leaned her head against the cold glass and closed her eyes, and against all odds slept. She woke because the cabin had changed. It is a thing you learn if you have spent enough years in places where the next sound might be the one that matters. You learn to sleep with one ear awake, and you learn that a room has a baseline, a hum it makes when everything is fine, and that the most important information you will ever receive is the moment that hum changes pitch. Maya had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours. The cabin was dim, most reading lights off, the engines a steady gray roar, and then, underneath it, a wrong note, a scrape, a sharp intake of breath that was not her own, the particular, unmistakable sound of a body that is no longer doing what its owner is telling it to do. She was awake before she knew why. Beside her, the seat 27C was empty, the gray blanket sliding to the floor, the paperback splayed open on the seat cushion with its spine cracked, and in the aisle, just past her own knees, Harlan Mercer was going down. He did not fall the way people fall in films. He folded. His knees simply stopped agreeing to hold him, and he went down sideways against the armrest of 27D, and the woman in 27D, a young mother with a sleeping infant against her shoulder, gasped and pulled the baby clear, and Mr. Mercer slid the rest of the way to the carpet and lay there with one arm trapped under him and his reading glasses skidding away on their cord and his face the color of wet ash. Maya was out of her seat before the glasses stopped moving. She did not shout. That was the first thing the people around her would remember afterward when they tried to explain why they had trusted her, that she did not shout, did not gasp, did not freeze. She moved the way water moves when a dam breaks, all at once and entirely toward the low place. She was on her knees beside him in the aisle, and her hands were already working, 2 fingers to the side of his throat, her cheek dropping toward his mouth, her eyes going to his chest. Sir, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand." Nothing. The hand under hers was slack. The throat under her fingers had a pulse, but it was wrong, fast and thin and uneven, a rhythm that stumbled like a man walking on a sprained ankle. She looked up. Tui was already coming, fast, down the aisle from the galley, her young face stripped of its sing-song, and Maya caught her eyes and held them. "I need the medical kit, the big one, the AED, oxygen if you have it, and I need you to make a call for a doctor on the PA right now. Go." Tui went. She did not ask who Maya was. She would think about that later. that in the first 30 seconds, the only person on the airplane who sounded like she knew what came next was a woman in a gray sweater who had not introduced herself. People in a crisis do not follow rank. They follow certainty. Maya had learned that in a tent in a desert a long time ago, and it had never once stopped being true. She bent back to Mr. Mercer. Harlan, that's your name, isn't it? You told the flight attendant. Stay with me, Harlan. Open your eyes for me. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved. No sound. But the pulse under her fingers was still there, and a man with a pulse is a man you can fight for. Then a shadow fell across them both, and a polished, carrying voice said, all right, everyone back. Give him room. I'm a doctor." And Maya looked up into the face of Dr. Preston Vance, and the second part of the night began. He came down the aisle the way a man comes down a hospital corridor he owns. Fast, sure, his blazer off now, his sleeves going up, his eyes already cataloging the patient and dismissing everyone else. He was, Maya saw at once, a real doctor. There was no faking the way his eyes went straight to the right places. Lips, chest, the angle of the slack jaw. She felt a small flicker of relief. 2 sets of trained hands were better than one. She started to give him the picture, fast and clean, the way you hand off a patient. Sudden collapse, maybe 90 seconds ago. He's got a pulse, but it's thready and irregular. Rates up around 140. He's not responsive to voice. He was, "Thank you." He did not look at her. He said it the way you'd thank a waiter for taking the plate. He put his own hand on Mr. Mercer's chest, on his wrist, and Maya watched him feel for the pulse she had just described to him, watched him confirm with his own fingers the exact thing she had said, and she understood that he had not heard a word. He had heard a voice that was not his telling him something, and he had filed it under noise. "He's tachycardic," Vance announced to the cabin in general. "Irregular. Possible cardiac event. I need this area cleared, and I need the medical kit." He glanced up, found Tui returning with the orange hard case and the defibrillator, and reached for them. Good, Maya thought. Fine. She didn't care whose hands did it. She reached for the AED case too, to open it, to get the pads out, because seconds mattered, and the machine took a few of them to wake up. And that was when Dr. Vance finally looked at her. He took her in the way he took in everything, fast, complete, and wrong. The gray sweater, the plain face, the lack of a stethoscope, a badge, a white coat, any of the small signals he had spent 30 years learning to read. And he made his judgment, and he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Sit down. You're just a nurse." A beat. His hands were busy. He didn't even slow down. "Let the real doctor work. Go back to your seat. You'll only be in the way." The aisle went very quiet. Tui froze with the kit half open. The young mother in 27D stared. A man 2 rows back made a small sound of protest and then thought better of it. And Maya Okafor knelt in the aisle of Flight 414 with a dying man's pulse fading under the heel of her hand, and looked at the doctor across the body, and in that moment she made a decision she had made 100 times before. She let it go, not because he was right, because the man on the floor was more important than her pride, and arguing with Preston Vance would cost Harlan Mercer seconds Harlan Mercer did not have. She had buried enough patience to know exactly what pride cost, measured in heartbeats, so she did not stand up and announce who she was. She did not produce a card. She simply slid her hands to a different part of the patient, the airway, the place Vance was not looking, and she said evenly, "I'll manage his airway, doctor. You run the rest." It was not a request for permission. It was a fact delivered politely, and Vance, busy ripping open the AED, took it as deference and let her stay, which was exactly what she wanted. She did not need his respect. She needed his patient to keep breathing. She would settle the rest of it later, or never. It did not matter to her which. She had no way of knowing that the later was already on its way, 11 rows up and behind a locked door, and that he wore 4 stripes on his shoulder and had, in another life, called men and women like her by a single word and meant it as the highest thing he knew how to say. Let me tell you about the airplane for a moment, because the airplane is the third character in this story, and it does not care about anyone's rank. At 38,000 feet, the air outside the windows is about 60 degrees below zero and too thin to keep a person conscious for more than a handful of seconds. The cabin you sit in is a pressurized aluminum tube holding a fragile bubble of breathable air, and everything inside it, the warmth, the oxygen, the ordinary miracle of being able to read a paperback over the ocean, exists because pumps and seals and engines are all doing their jobs at once. It is the safest way humans have ever invented to travel. It is also, when a heart fails inside it, one of the loneliest places on earth. There is no ambulance. There is no second hospital down the road. There is no specialist you can call to walk through the door in 10 minutes. There is only what is on the airplane, and who is on the airplane, and how fast. The nearest place Flight 414 could land was a small airfield on a rock in the North Atlantic, and it was 2 hours away. 2 hours. The captain would do the math in his head later, and his jaw would tighten because 2 hours is a very long time to keep a failing heart going with what fits in an orange plastic case. 2 hours is a war. And in the first 10 minutes of that war, Dr. Preston Vance made his first real mistake. He read the situation as a heart attack. It was a reasonable first guess. Older man, sudden collapse, racing irregular pulse. The cardiologist's hammer, and everything is a nail shaped like a coronary. He got the AED pads onto Mr. Mercer's chest, which was right, and he watched the little screen for a rhythm to shock, which was also right, and the machine looked at Harlan Mercer's heart and said, in its calm, robotic way, no shock advised, because it was not that kind of problem. Not yet. Vance frowned at the machine as if it had failed him personally. Run it again, he said. Maya, with 2 fingers on the carotid and her eyes on the man's face, had already seen something Vance had not, because she had not been looking at the heart. She had been looking at the whole person, which is a different kind of training entirely. She had seen the leather case of pills knocked off the tray table. She had seen the way his collapse had a stutter to it before the fold, a moment where he had clutched not at his chest but at his throat. She had seen his lips and the faint puffiness starting at the line of his jaw, and the way his breathing, what there was of it, had a high thin whistle riding under it like a wire. "Doctor," she said, "I don't think this is his heart." "Of course it's his heart." He didn't look up. "Run the AED again." "His airway's closing." She said it flat, certain, the way you'd report a coordinate. "Listen to him breathe. He's got stridor. His jaw and lips are swelling. This looks like anaphylaxis, an allergic reaction. The tachycardia's secondary. We need epinephrine, and we need it now, not a shock." For 1 second, 1 single second, Preston Vance looked at her, really looked the way he should have the first time, and something flickered behind his eyes, some old reflex of a younger doctor who used to listen, and Maya thought, "There, good, we have him." And then the second passed, and the ivy grew back over the window, and he heard again only that it was a voice that was not his, attached to a gray sweater, telling him he was wrong in front of 300 people. "It's a cardiac event," he said, and his voice had gone hard. "I have performed 4,000 cardiac interventions. I think I know what I'm looking at. Now I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and let me work, or I am going to have you removed." And he turned away from her, and he turned away from the truth, and he reached again for the machine that could not help, because admitting she was right would have cost him something he valued more than he understood. It would cost Harlan Mercer more. Tui was kneeling at the head of the aisle with the medical kit open across her knees, and she was the one who became, without anyone deciding it, the hinge the whole night swung on. She was 26. She had been flying for 14 months. She had been trained for medical emergencies the way all the crew were trained. A course, a mannequin, a laminated checklist in the manual, and she had never once had to use it for anything worse than a fainting passenger and a bloody nose. She was frightened in the specific way of a competent young person who knows exactly how far the edge of her competence is and can feel her toes hanging over it. And she was caught now between two voices, the loud, certain man with the famous face who said heart, and the quiet, certain woman with no face at all who said airway. She did what frightened, competent young people do when they don't know who to trust. She watched their hands. She watched Dr. Vance's hands run the AED a second time and get the same flat answer. She watched him stare at the screen with the beginning of something that was not quite panic, but was related to it by blood. And she watched the woman in the gray sweater. The woman was not staring at anything. The woman's hands were moving, tilting the patient's head, lifting his chin, clearing his airway, her ear down by his mouth, her whole body a quiet instrument pointed at one question: is air still getting in? And Tui noticed that the woman's hands did not shake, not the smallest tremor. In 14 months of flying, Tui had learned to read fear in the hands of passengers, and there was no fear in these hands at all. There was only work. "You said epinephrine," Tui said, quietly, to Maya, not to Vance. Maya's eyes came up and locked onto hers, and something passed between them. The recognition of one person who is going to be useful by another. Yes, there should be an EpiPen in the enhanced kit. An auto-injector looks like a fat yellow pen. If not that, then an ampoule of epinephrine, 1 in 1,000, and a syringe. Find me either one, and see if anyone, make the call again, ask if anyone on board carries their own EpiPen, a passenger with allergies, anyone. "He's not having an allergic reaction," Vance's voice cut across them. "Do not give this man epinephrine for a cardiac event. You could kill him. Nurse, I am ordering you to stop." And here is the thing about that moment, the thing that mattered. Vance was not entirely wrong to be careful. Epinephrine is a serious drug. In the wrong situation, it can make a bad heart worse. A cautious doctor double-checks before pushing it. If this had been a heart attack, his caution would have been correct and Maya's instinct would have been dangerous. He was not a fool. He was a careful, skilled man looking at the wrong diagnosis with total confidence, and that is far more dangerous than a fool, because a fool can be ignored. Maya understood all of it, and she understood too that she could not win this with credentials she was not willing to show, and a man who would not hear them anyway. So she did the only thing left. She turned to the patient and she made the patient prove her case. "Harlan," she leaned close to his ear. "Harlan, I need you to do one thing for me. Did you eat something? On the plane, before. Something you don't usually eat." His head moved, the smallest fraction, a nod that was barely a nod. "Was there nuts? Shellfish? Something the meal?" Another flutter. His hand, the one not trapped beneath him, lifted 2 inches off the carpet, and his fingers found her sleeve and gripped it, and his lips shaped a word with no breath behind it, and the word was throat. Maya looked up. Not at Vance, at Tui. "Get me the manifest of the meal service. Was there a nut product in anything served in the last hour? And get me that epinephrine. Beat. Please." Tui looked at the famous doctor. She looked at the quiet woman. She looked at the old man's hand gripping the gray sweater and his lips making the shape of the word throat. And Tui made her choice, and it was the right one, and she would be proud of it for the rest of her life. She started digging through the kit for a fat yellow pen. I want to be fair to Preston Vance, because the easy version of this story makes him a monster, and he was not a monster. He was something more common and more dangerous than a monster. He was a good man who had stopped being able to hear. He had not always been this way. 30 years back, he'd been a resident who stayed late, who learned the nurses' names because the nurses knew things the textbooks didn't, who had been saved more than once from his own confidence by a charge nurse with 20 years on the floor, saying quietly, "Doctor, you might want to look again." He had known once the thing that every good clinician knows and every great one never forgets, that the person with the title is not always the person with the answer, and that the work does not care about the hierarchy, only about the truth. But success had been very kind to Preston Vance, and kindness of that particular kind is corrosive. Every year, fewer people corrected him. Every year, more people laughed at his jokes and deferred to his certainty and put his face on a book. Every year, the gap widened between how often he was right and how often he was told he was right, until he could no longer feel the difference, and a man who cannot feel the difference between being right and being agreed with is a man who has lost the most important instrument he owns. So when a woman in a gray sweater knelt across a dying man and told him calmly that he was wrong, he did not hear a colleague. He heard a challenge to the only thing he had left that he was sure of, and he defended it the way frightened, proud men always do, by reaching for rank. "You're just a nurse. Sit down. Let the real doctor work." The cruelest words are almost never about the person they're aimed at. They're about the fear in the person saying them. Vance was not belittling Maya because she was small. He was belittling her because somewhere underneath the tan and the watch and the 4,000 interventions, he had just felt for one cold second that she might be right, and he could not afford for that to be true. The tragedy of it was that there were two skilled people kneeling over Harlan Mercer, and either one of them alone could have saved him, and the only thing standing between Harlan Mercer and a calm survival was one man's inability to share a floor. Maya knew all of this, not in words, not in that moment. There was no time for a moment to think it through, but she had knelt across from 100 Preston Vances in her life, in trauma bays and field tents and the backs of helicopters, and she knew the species on site, and she knew the only thing that ever moved them was not an argument, it was a result. So she stopped trying to convince the doctor, and she set out to save the patient in spite of him, and to do it so undeniably that the truth would convince him for her. That was always how it ended. She let the work speak. The work had never once lied for her, and it would not start tonight. "I found it." Tui's voice cracked with relief. She held up a fat yellow auto-injector and a second one behind it, the enhanced kit's epinephrine, exactly where Maya had said. "There's two, and—" she had the laminated meal card too, the one the galley kept, and her finger was on a line of it, and her face had gone pale. "The chicken satay, the starter, it's got peanut." He had the chicken satay. I cleared his tray myself. I saw the little stick. The cabin, which had been holding its breath, let out a low collective sound. And Preston Vance, kneeling there with his hand on a chest that did not have a heart attack in it, felt the floor tilt under his certainty for the first time in 15 years. Peanut, satay, the old man's swelling jaw, the whistle in his breathing, the flat refusal of the defibrillator to find anything worth shocking. He was a brilliant man. The pieces assembled themselves in front of him whether he wanted them to or not, and what they assembled into was the diagnosis the nurse had given him 4 minutes ago, and 4 minutes is a very long time when an airway is closing. For a moment, and Maya saw it, and to her credit she took no satisfaction in it, Vance simply stopped. His hands went still. The certainty drained out of his face and left something raw and human behind it. The face of a man watching his own confidence turn out to be the thing that nearly killed his patient. But pride does not die quietly, and it does not die all at once. "Give it to me." He reached for the auto-injector. "I'll administer it." And Maya, who had every reason in the world to snatch it away, who had been humiliated and dismissed and ordered to her seat, did something that told you everything about who she actually was. She handed it to him, because his hands were closer to the patient's thigh, because every second mattered more than every grievance, because the point had never been to win. Lateral thigh, she said, calm, already moving to support the airway. Through the trousers is fine. Hold it 10 seconds. Then we'll need the second one ready. Anaphylaxis can rebound. Vance took the pen, his hands, and this is the part he would remember, lying awake in hotel rooms for years, his hands shook. The famous cardiologist, 4,000 interventions, and his hands shook on a yellow plastic pen because a nurse he had dismissed had just been proven right in front of 300 people, and a dying man was paying the interest on his pride. He pressed the injector to Harlan Mercer's outer thigh. It clicked. He counted, and Maya, 2 feet away, kept the old man's airway open with her bare hands and her whole attention, and waited to see if they had been fast enough. The epinephrine went to work, not instantly. It is a drug, not a miracle. But within 90 seconds, the high, thin whistle in Mr. Mercer's breathing began, almost imperceptibly, to widen. The terrible blue tint at his lips warmed by a shade. His chest, which had been fighting for every cup of air, drew one breath that was almost a real breath. "There," Maya said softly to the patient, not to the cabin. "There you go, Harlan. Come on back." It was not over. It was nowhere near over. But for the first time since he had folded into the aisle, Harlan Mercer was, by a hair, winning. And Preston Vance knelt back on his heels and looked at the woman across the body of the man they had just kept alive together, and he opened his mouth, and for one moment it looked as if he might say the thing a better man would have said. He didn't. Not yet. The night was not done teaching him. Here is what nobody in the aisle knew, in the long minutes while the first dose of epinephrine did its quiet work. Anaphylaxis is not a door that opens once. It is a tide. You can drive it back with epinephrine and watch the patient improve and feel the relief flood the cabin. And then, 20 or 40 minutes later, the tide comes back in, the biphasic reaction, the second wave, and it can come back harder than the first. And if you have used your tools and relaxed your guard, it can take a patient who looked saved and drown him a second time. Maya knew this. It was why, even as Mr. Mercer's color improved and a ragged cheer almost rose from the rows around them, she did not relax a single muscle. She kept the second auto-injector in her left hand. She kept her eyes on his chest. She kept her body coiled. And she did one more thing, a small thing, that no one noticed, but that would matter more than any of them could guess. With her free hand, without thinking, she had reached into the breast pocket of her shirt under the sweater and closed her fingers around the small brass coin with the worn-down nightingale, and she pressed her thumb against it once, hard, the way she always did when she was about to settle in for a long fight, because that was what this was now, a long fight. She had stabilized the patient. She had not cured him. They were 2 hours from a runway, and she had perhaps 2 injectors and 1 oxygen bottle and a defibrillator that couldn't help, and a tide that was going to come back in, and a famous doctor who had been wrong once and might, out of wounded pride, choose to be wrong again at exactly the wrong moment. She looked up at Tui. "How long until we can land?" Tui keyed her handset, spoke low into it, listened. When she lowered it, her face was careful. "The captain's already turned us. We're diverting, but the nearest field that can take us is," she swallowed, "about 2 hours out. Maybe a little less if they let us come in fast. 2 hours." Maya nodded slowly and did the arithmetic that she had done 1,000 times in worse places, the arithmetic of what she had against how long she had to make it last. 2 injectors, 1 bottle of oxygen, and she didn't know yet how full, an airway she could hold open with her hands as long as her hands held out, a patient with a 71-year-old heart that had just been put through a tachycardic storm, and 2 hours of black ocean. All right, she said to no one and to herself. All right, we can do 2 hours. She did not say it like a hope. She said it like an order she was giving to the universe, and up and down the rows nearest her, strangers who had no reason to trust a woman in a gray sweater found to their own surprise that they did. There is a kind of calm that is contagious, and it comes only from people who have been somewhere very bad and come back, and Maya had it, and it spread down the aisle of Flight 414 like warmth from a fire. Everyone felt it. Even Vance felt it, especially Vance, who had spent 30 years being the calmest person in every room and had just discovered, at 38,000 feet, that he was not the calmest person in this one. The next 40 minutes were the quiet part, which in a story like this is the most dangerous part because quiet is where pride goes to regroup. They got Harlan Mercer settled, not into a seat. Maya wouldn't allow it. She wanted him flat with his legs up and his airway accessible, but onto a nest of blankets on the galley floor where there was room to work and a wall to brace him against. Tui got the oxygen flowing through a mask, and Maya adjusted it and checked the bottle's gauge and did not like the number she saw but said nothing. The young mother from 27D, whose name was Reza, turned out to be a veterinary technician of all things and quietly offered to help, and Maya put her to good use holding the patient's hand and talking to him, keeping him tethered to the world by the sound of a kind voice. A retired school teacher across the aisle organized the nearby passengers to keep the area clear without being asked. The airplane, in its emergency, was knitting itself into something like a team, and Maya ran it, not by announcing that she was running it, by simply being the person who knew the next thing to do every time and saying it clearly until everyone around her had, without a vote, agreed that she was in charge. Even Vance had drifted into the role of her assistant, fetching, holding, doing the tasks she assigned in the flat, economical voice she used now. Pressure here, watch his color, tell me if that whistle comes back, and for a little while it almost worked. 2 skilled people and a willing crew, keeping a man alive over the ocean. Then the airplane reminded everyone whose house this was. It started as a tremor, the soft shudder of a wing finding rough air, and then the seatbelt chime rang out and the cabin dropped a sickening foot and a half and came up hard, and a tray of water cups went off a galley counter and burst on the floor, and Harlan Mercer's oxygen mask slid off his face. Maya had it back on him before the airplane finished its second buck, her body curled over his on instinct, her shoulder braced against the galley wall and one hand flat on his chest to keep him from rolling, riding the turbulence the way she had ridden worse in the canvas-walled bellies of aircraft that had been actively trying to come apart. "Hold the mask," she said to Reza, who had grabbed a stanchion with white knuckles. "Both hands. Don't let it move no matter what the airplane does." And then, to Vance, flat, "Brace him on your side. We don't let him slide." The chop ran for 90 long seconds. When it smoothed, Maya checked the oxygen gauge again, and this time she let one word out under her breath, because the needle had moved much faster than it should have, and the number it sat on now was a problem. "What is it?" Vance asked. He had learned in the last hour to read her face. "The bottle's running low, faster than it should be. That buck must have cracked a seal on the line, or it's just an old bottle." She did the arithmetic out loud because she wanted Tui to hear it and start solving. "We've got maybe 25 minutes of flow at this rate. We need it to last 90, so we changed the math." She looked up. "Tui, is there a second bottle? Walk around, portable, anything in any other galley?" Tui was already moving. "There's a walk-around bottle in the aft galley and one up front for the crew. I'll get both." "Get them, and bring me tape, the cloth tape from the kit, and find me a clean drinking straw and a plastic cup." It was the sort of request that made no sense to anyone who had not improvised oxygen delivery in a place with no proper masks, and perfect sense to anyone who had. Maya turned the flow down, not off, down to a trickle, dropping the patient into the lowest delivery that would still hold his numbers. And then she rigged a simple thing with the cup and the straw and the tape that turned a wide-open mask into a conserving one, capturing the oxygen instead of letting 2/3 of it spill into the cabin between his breaths. It was crude. It was ugly. It bought her 40 minutes she had not had a moment before, and 40 minutes when you are 90 from a runway is the difference between making it and not. It was, in its way, the most revealing thing she had done all night. Not the diagnosis, which a sharp clinician might have made, but the field-rigged conserver out of a paper cup and a straw, which only a person who had practiced medicine where the supplies ran out and the patients didn't would even think to try. Vance watched her do it, and something crossed his face that was no longer resentment. It was closer to wonder. He had spent 30 years in rooms with everything he could possibly need within arm's reach. He had never once had to make oxygen last. He was watching a kind of medicine he had read about and never practiced, performed under his nose by a woman he had called just a nurse, and the cognitive distance between those two facts was beginning, visibly, to hurt him. But pride, even cornered, finds an audience, and the audience had grown. A man 2 rows back, 40-ish, expensive headphones around his neck, the particular restless energy of someone used to being the smartest person in his meetings, had been filming on his phone for several minutes, and now he leaned into the aisle and said, to the cabin as much as to Maya, "Has anyone confirmed this woman is actually qualified? I'm just saying. We've got a real doctor right here, and we're letting some lady tape a cup to his face. Somebody should be documenting this." He held the phone a little higher. "I'm documenting this." Maya did not stop working. She did not even look at him. "You want to be useful with that phone," she said evenly. "Go to seat 14C. There's a gentleman wearing a medical alert bracelet. Ask him what he's allergic to and whether he carries an injector, because if this man rebounds, I want a backup, and I'd rather know now than in 10 minutes. Or keep filming, your choice, but pick one because I don't have a hand free to care which." A beat. "And turn the flash off. It's in his eyes." The man blinked, lowered the phone, and then, because there are more good people on an airplane than bad ones, and most of the bad ones are only frightened, he got up and went to seat 14C, and he came back 2 minutes later with the name of an allergy and the news that yes, the gentleman carried an injector and would gladly lend it, and he handed Maya that information like a man handing over a thing he was suddenly ashamed he hadn't offered sooner. Maya thanked him by it. "Good. That's a real help. Thank you." And he sat back down, smaller and somehow better, and put his phone away for the rest of the flight. It almost worked even then. And then the last of the audience that mattered remembered it had a reputation to protect. Because by now word had moved through the cabin, the way it does, passenger to passenger, and the story it carried was not the story Vance wanted told. The story it carried was, the doctor was wrong and the nurse was right. He had heard it himself, in the murmur of the rows, in the way people's eyes went to Maya now and slid past him. The famous cardiologist, the face on the book, and the verdict moving down the aisle was that he had nearly killed a man, and a nurse had saved him. It was not entirely fair. He had administered the epinephrine after all, his hands had done it, but it was true enough to burn, and a proud man who feels a true thing burning will, more often than not, reach for a way to make it not true. Vance reached for the only tool he had ever known how to use. He reached for rank. "I want to be clear about something," he said. He stood up. He said it not to Maya, but to the cabin, in the carrying voice from the boarding gate, the voice built for a podium. "I am the physician of record in this emergency. I have managed it. This woman," he did not look at her, "is a nurse, and she has been helpful, but I am the one with the medical authority here, and from this point I'll be directing this patient's care. Thank you." The cabin went cold and quiet, and Maya Okafor, kneeling on a galley floor with her hands keeping a man breathing, finally lifted her head and looked at Preston Vance, and for the first time all night, something moved behind her steady eyes that had not been there before. It was not anger. It was worse than anger for him. It was the look of a person who has just decided to stop being patient. She did not stand up. Standing up would have meant taking her hands off Harlan Mercer, and she would not do that for anything, least of all for the satisfaction of facing a man down. But she spoke, and her voice, which had been soft all night, soft and quick and kind, dropped into a register that none of them had heard from her yet. It was very quiet. It carried to the back of the cabin. "Doctor, I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to go back to keeping this man alive, because that is the only thing in this cabin that matters." She kept her eyes on him. "You misdiagnosed an airway emergency as a cardiac event. You refused epinephrine for 4 minutes while this man's throat closed. He is alive right now because a flight attendant chose to listen, and because we got the drug in before the airway shut. And we got there late, doctor. We got there 4 minutes late, and 4 minutes is the difference between this man waking up himself and this man waking up someone else. So you can be the physician of record on the paperwork. I do not care about the paperwork. But you will not direct his care because you have already shown me how you direct care, and I have watched men die from that exact brand of certainty, and I am not going to watch it again at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic. You could have heard a pin drop in that cabin. You could have heard a breath. And one more thing." Her voice did not rise. It got, if anything, quieter, and somehow that was the thing that made the hair stand up on the necks of the people listening. "You keep calling me just a nurse, as if you know what that means. You don't. You have no idea what the nurses you've spent 30 years not listening to have actually done. You have no idea what this one has done. And the worst part, doctor, is that it wouldn't have mattered if I were just a nurse and nothing else, because a nurse is the person who was right tonight and you were wrong, and a title is not a substitute for being right. It never has been. You, of all people, should know that." She turned back to Harlan Mercer. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. But Preston Vance, stung past the last of his judgment, made the worst decision of the entire night. He turned to Tui and he pulled the only rank he had left. "I want her removed from this patient," he said. "I am a doctor, and I am invoking my medical authority, and I am instructing the crew to restrain this passenger and return her to her seat. She is interfering with a physician. Make the call to the flight deck, now." And Tui, 26 years old and 14 months a flight attendant, looked from the famous doctor to the quiet woman to the old man breathing on the floor, and she did the only thing her training actually told her to do when 2 passengers were in conflict during a medical emergency and a physician was invoking authority. She picked up the interphone and she called the captain. The flight deck of Flight 414 was a small, dim, humming room with 2 seats, 1,000 instruments, and a sky full of stars on the other side of the glass. In the left seat sat Captain Daniel Reyes. He was 54 years old, with iron gray hair cut short and a face weathered into deep, calm lines, and he had 31 years and 19,000 hours of flying behind him. The last 11 of those years had been with the airline. The first 20 had been somewhere else, somewhere he didn't talk about much at the crew hotel bar, somewhere that had taught him to fly very large aircraft into and out of places where people were trying to prevent exactly that. He had a way of going completely still when things went wrong, a stillness his first officers found unnerving until they understood it for what it was. The stillness of a man who had been frightened so many times, so badly, that fear had simply become information to him. One more gauge to read. He had already turned the airplane. The diversion was set, the new field programmed, the company and the controllers notified. He had been getting updates from the cabin through the interphone for the better part of an hour. Collapse, possible cardiac, then the correction to anaphylaxis, then stabilized, and he had been doing in the back of his calm mind the same arithmetic Maya had been doing in the galley. How long against how much? 2 hours. He didn't like it either. When the interphone chimed again, he answered it himself. Flight deck. Captain. It was Tui, and her voice was tight in a way it had not been on the previous calls. I have a situation with the passengers helping the patient. There's a physician on board, a Dr. Vance, and there's another passenger, a woman, and their captain. They're in conflict about the patient's care, and the doctor's invoking medical authority and instructing me to remove the woman and restrain her. But, sir, she dropped her voice, turned away from the cabin. Sir, she's the one who's been right the whole time. The doctor said it was a heart attack and she said it was an allergy and she was right, and now the patient's stable because of her and the doctor wants her gone. I don't I don't think I should remove her, but he's a doctor and he's ordering me to. I need you to tell me what to do. Captain Reyes was quiet for a moment. His first officer glanced over. What's the woman's name? Reyes asked. The one who was right. A pause. The sound of Tui turning, asking. Then, she just said Maya. Maya Okafor. She didn't want to give it, sir. She said it doesn't matter. She just wants to keep working on him. And in the dim, humming cockpit of Flight 414, 38,000 feet over the black Atlantic, Captain Daniel Reyes went very, very still. Not the operational stillness, a different one. The stillness of a man who has just heard a name he thought he would never hear again, in the last place on earth he expected to hear it. Say that again, he said softly. The last name, spell it. Okafor. Okafor. Captain, are you... Describe her. His voice had changed. The first officer was staring at him now. Quickly. The woman. Tall, short. How old? 40, maybe? Brown skin, short hair, gray sweater. She's... Captain, she's the calmest person I've ever seen. She's been running the whole thing like she's done it 1,000... Does she? Reyes said, and something was happening to his voice. Something that the first officer had never heard there in 3 years of flying together. A kind of roughness, a kind of awe. Does she have a coin? A little brass coin. Does she keep touching her chest pocket? Silence on the line. Then Tui, bewildered. Yes, sir. She took something out of her pocket. A little metal thing, she's holding it. How did you... Captain Reyes closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he was already unbuckling his harness. You will not remove that woman from that patient, he said. You will not touch her. You will give her anything she asks for, anything on this airplane, and you will tell the doctor that the captain said the medical authority on board this flight now belongs to her. Do you understand me? Tell him those exact words. Sir, I don't... Who is she? Captain Reyes stood up in the cramped flight deck, and he straightened his uniform jacket with both hands, the unconscious gesture of a man making himself presentable for something that mattered, and he said the thing that turned the whole night over on its hinge. She's a colonel, he said. Tell the doctor to step back from the colonel. I'm coming out. The interphone clicked off, and Tui stood in the galley of Flight 414 holding a dead handset and a sentence she did not understand. She turned around slowly. The doctor was waiting, arms crossed, jaw set, certain that the captain's authority was about to back his own. The cabin was watching, and the woman in the gray sweater was on her knees on the floor, with her hands keeping a man alive, exactly where she had been for the last hour, paying no attention to any of it, because to her none of it had ever been the point. What did he say? Vance demanded. Is he sending crew? Is she being removed? Tui opened her mouth, closed it, found her voice. The captain said she had to stop and start again. The captain said the medical authority on board now belongs to her, to Ms. Okafor. He said you're to step back, and he said... She looked at Maya, who had gone, very slightly still. He said to tell you to step back from the colonel. The word landed in the cabin like a stone in a still pond. The what? Said Vance. The colonel. Tui said. He said he's coming out. He said he's coming out himself. For the first time all night, Maya Okafor closed her eyes, just for a second. The hand that was not holding Harlan Mercer's airway went, without her deciding it, to the breast pocket of her shirt and pressed the small brass coin through the cloth, and her lips moved, and the people nearest her thought she might have said very quietly, "Oh, Danny," though no one was sure, and she never confirmed it, because she knew that voice on the other end of the interphone. She had not heard it in 7 years. The last time she had heard it, it had been coming through her headset over a different ocean, in a different aircraft, a younger man's voice saying her call sign and telling her the landing zone was hot and asking her, with everything he had, whether she could keep the man on the stretcher alive for 11 more minutes, and she had said yes, and she had, and they had both lived to grow gray and end up, by the long arithmetic of chance, on the same airplane over the same kind of dark water, with one more life on the line between them. She opened her eyes. She looked at Vance, who had gone the color of paper. "I didn't want to do this," she said, quietly, almost gently. "I want you to know that. I never want to do this. I just wanted to keep him breathing until the wheels came down. That's all I ever want." And then the door at the front of the cabin opened, and Captain Daniel Reyes walked back into the lights, and the whole airplane turned to look. He came down the aisle slowly. He was not a large man, but the cabin made room for him the way cabins make room for the person who is finally in charge of everything. His uniform was plain, dark, 4 stripes on the shoulder boards, no flash, no insignia beyond the simple marks of his rank in the airline. His face was the weathered calm of a man who flew for a living, and his eyes, as he came down the aisle, were fixed on one place and one person, and they were doing something that no one in that cabin had seen a uniformed captain's eyes do. They were filling. He stopped a few feet from the galley. He looked down at the woman on the floor. The gray sweater, the cropped gray threaded hair, the steady hands keeping a stranger alive, and Maya Okafor looked up at him, and for a moment the two of them just looked at each other across 7 years and 2 oceans, and a man they were both in their own ways still trying to save. "Colonel," Captain Reyes said. His voice was not steady. He didn't try to make it steady. "Colonel Okafor." And then, in the aisle of a packed commercial airliner at 38,000 feet, with 300 strangers watching and a dying man on the floor between them and a famous doctor standing frozen with his certainty in ruins around his feet, Captain Daniel Reyes brought his heels together, and he straightened his spine, and he raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate, immaculate salute, and he held it. He held it. The cabin made a sound, not a cheer, something lower than a cheer and deeper, a long, indrawn breath, 300 people understanding all at once that they had spent the last hour watching a story whose meaning they had not known, and that the woman they had seen humiliated in the aisle, ordered to her seat, called just a nurse, was something none of them had imagined, and that the man who flew their airplane was standing at attention to her in a way that meant it. Maya did not stand. She could not. Her hands were full of Harlan Mercer's life, but she lifted her chin, and she met the captain's eyes, and she gave him the only thing she could from the floor, a single grave nod, the nod of one professional to another, the nod that said, "I see you, Danny, and thank you. And now lower your hand. There's still a man to save." He lowered it. And then, because she could not return it from where she knelt, and because some salutes are returned in other ways, Captain Reyes did something the cabin would talk about for years. He knelt down beside her on the galley floor, in his pressed uniform, his 4 stripes on the dirty carpet, and he said, low, only to her, "What do you need, Colonel? You've got the whole airplane. Tell me what you need." And Maya Okafor, who had carried this man's voice in her memory for 7 years, who had never once said her rank aloud to anyone on this flight, who had let the work speak because the work always did, looked at her old friend kneeling beside her, and the smallest, weariest, most human smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I need more oxygen than I've got," she said, "and I need you to put this airplane on the ground before the tide comes back in. Can you do that for me, Captain?" "Yes, Colonel," said Daniel Reyes. "I can do that." And he stood, and he went to do it, and the airplane that had been a place of confusion an hour before became, in the space of one salute, a place of purpose. 300 people who had watched a woman be diminished had just watched her be revealed, and the difference between those two things, the diminishing and the revealing, was the whole reason any of them would remember this flight for the rest of their lives. But I told you the night was not done teaching, and it wasn't, and the lesson it had left was the hardest one, and it was for Preston Vance. He had not moved. He stood pressed against the row of seats where the captain's salute had pinned him, and the famous tan had gone out of his face entirely, and he was looking at Maya Okafor, the way a man looks at a word he has been mispronouncing his whole life, and has just, in public, finally heard said correctly. "Colonel." The flight attendant had said it, and he had not believed it. The captain had said it and saluted, and a captain does not salute a passenger, and a captain certainly does not kneel. Vance's whole understanding of the last hour, the gray sweater, the plain face, just a nurse, sit down, let the real doctor work, was rearranging itself behind his eyes into a shape he could barely stand to look at. Because here is what Preston Vance understood, standing there, that the rest of the cabin only half grasped. He understood, as a fellow professional, what it meant. He understood that colonel over a battlefield with a medical specialty did not mean a nurse who happened to have a rank. It meant a flight surgeon. It meant a physician, a doctor like him, only one who had earned her medicine in places where the patients arrived in pieces and the operating theater was a tent under fire, and the nearest specialist was 4,000 miles and a war away. It meant that the woman he had ordered to sit down, the woman he had called just a nurse, the woman whose airway diagnosis he had dismissed for 4 critical minutes, had very likely managed more genuine emergencies in a single year than he had managed in his entire celebrated career, and had done it with less, under worse, with lives stacked up around her like cordwood and no book deal at the end of it. He had not been corrected by a nurse. He had been corrected and had refused the correction and had nearly killed a man in front of a colonel who outranked every assumption he had made. He could not speak for the length of 3 slow breaths. And then, in a voice that had lost every ounce of the podium, every ounce of the carrying confidence, a small voice, a true voice, Preston Vance said the only word he had left. "I'm sorry." Maya did not look up from Harlan Mercer. "Don't tell me," she said, not cruelly, just tired and just true. "Tell him, when he wakes up, tell him a doctor was so sure he was right that he almost let him die, and that you'll never be that sure again. That's the apology that matters, the one you make to yourself every day for the rest of your career." A breath. "I've made it. It's not a comfortable apology, but it's the only one that ever made me better." And Preston Vance, celebrated, decorated, his face in 3 airport shops, stood in the aisle of Flight 414 and learned, at 58 years old, the thing he had stopped being able to hear at 30, that the title is not the truth, that the uniform is not the competence, that the person you are most tempted to dismiss is precisely the person you most need to listen to, and that the most dangerous words a clinician can ever say are the ones he says to keep from having to learn. He knelt down, not to her and not in front of her, beside her, at the patient's side in the place she pointed him to, and he put his hands where she told him to put them. And for the next 2 hours the famous cardiologist took his orders from the colonel he had called just a nurse, and did exactly as he was told, and did it well, because underneath the pride he really was a good doctor, and a good doctor will follow a better one once he finally understands which one is better. It is, in its way, the truest apology in the whole story, not the word, the 2 hours of doing as he was told. The tide came back in, of course. Maya had known it would. It came back roughly 50 minutes after the salute, when the airplane had begun its long descent toward the rock in the North Atlantic, and the cabin had let itself believe, a little, that the worst was over. Harlan Mercer, who had been breathing easier, who had even opened his eyes and squeezed Reza's hand, and asked in a thread of a voice whether he had missed the meal service, Harlan Mercer's airway began, again, to close. The whistle came back under his breath. The swelling, which had retreated, returned to the line of his jaw. His color slid back toward ash, and this time there was no argument about what it was, and no 4 minutes lost, because the colonel had been waiting for it with the second auto-injector in her hand and a doctor at her side, who now did exactly what she said the instant she said it. "Second dose," she said. "Lateral thigh. Now." Vance had it in before she finished the sentence. "Bag him. Tui. The mask. The bag valve. Squeeze when I say. Reza. Talk to him. Keep talking. Captain." She didn't even look up. "How long?" Reyes's voice came over the cabin PA, calm as still water, the voice of a man who had landed aircraft under conditions these passengers could not have imagined. 20 minutes to wheels down. Medical's on the field. Everybody stay seated and let the colonel work." Let the colonel work. The cabin had a new liturgy now. The next 20 minutes were the hardest of the flight, and they were also, in a strange way, the most beautiful, because they were the picture of what the first hour should have been. 2 skilled professionals and a brave crew, all rank between them dissolved into the single shared purpose of one fragile life, working in the seamless, wordless rhythm of people who have stopped caring who gets the credit. Maya ran it. Vance executed it. Tui and Reza held the line, and Harlan Mercer, 71 years old, flying home from burying his brother, hung on because the people around him refused to let him do anything else, and then the airplane found one last way to make them earn it. The second dose of epinephrine had opened Harlan's airway, which was what it was for, but epinephrine does not give without taking, and what it took was the steadiness of a 71-year-old heart that had already been through a tachycardic storm an hour before. Maya felt it under her fingers before any machine could have told her, the pulse going ragged, then wild, then falling into a fast, disorganized flutter that had no rhythm to it at all, the chambers of the heart no longer beating so much as quivering. His color, which had warmed, went gray again, but a different gray this time, not the gray of a throat closing, but the gray of a pump that has stopped pushing blood to the brain. "He's throwing an arrhythmia," she said. Fast, flat, no fear in it. "Not the airway this time. The heart? Rate's chaotic. I'm losing a pulse." She had the AED pad still on his chest from the first hour, and she keyed the machine awake, and for the first time all night the defibrillator looked at Harlan Mercer's heart and did not say no. Shock advised. It said the other thing. It said stand clear, and here at last, in the worst minute of the whole flight, the night handed Preston Vance the one thing it had been withholding from him, a problem that was actually his, because this, the chaotic rhythm, the failing pump, the electrical storm in a human heart, this was not field medicine. This was not the tent and the cup and the straw. This was a cardiac emergency, the exact thing Preston Vance had spent 30 years and 4,000 interventions learning to read in his sleep, and Maya knew it, and Maya did the thing that told you she had never once cared about being the hero. She looked at the man who had called her just a nurse, and she handed him the patient. "Vance, this one's yours. Talk to me. Shock. Then what? You know this rhythm better than I do. I'll run the airway and the compressions you call the cardiac. Go. And something extraordinary happened to Preston Vance's face. The pride was gone. It had been gone for an hour. But what replaced it now was not the smallness of a humbled man. It was the focus of a great clinician finally pointed at the thing he was actually great at, given to him by the very person he'd wronged, who had just trusted him with a life in front of the cabin that had watched him fail. Clear, Vance said, and his voice did not shake now because his hands knew this. Everybody off him. Clear. The machine fired. Harlan's body jolted. Resume compressions, Colonel. Hard and fast. Let me read it. And Maya was already on the chest, counting, and Vance watched the rhythm and called it the way a man calls a thing he has called 1,000 times, and on the second analysis, the wild flutter caught, stumbled, and dropped into a fast but organized beat, a real beat, a beat with blood behind it. There, Vance breathed. There it is. Sinus tack, but it's perfusing. He's back. He looked up at Maya across the body, and the two of them held a look that no one else in the cabin could have read, the look of two professionals who had each in one night saved a man from the exact thing the other one couldn't have, and who understood now, fully, what they had nearly thrown away over a gray sweater and a word. Good call, Maya said, quietly, and she meant it, and he knew she meant it, and of all the things said on Flight 414 that night, that was the one Preston Vance would carry the longest. Not the salute he watched, not the word Colonel, but 2 words from the woman he'd dismissed, telling him he'd done well. He had spent his whole life being told he was good by people who wanted something. He had just been told he was good by the one person on the airplane who wanted nothing from him at all, and it landed like the first true grade of his career. They were still 2 skilled professionals and a brave crew. But now they were something more exact than that. They were a team that had each saved the patient once and each saved the other once, and that is a thing no rank can hand you and no title can fake. The wheels came down hard on a short, wet runway on a rock in the middle of the ocean, in a crosswind that would have frightened a lesser pilot, and Captain Daniel Reyes greased it like it was nothing because for him, after the places he had landed, it was nothing. The airplane rolled out, the doors opened, and the airfield's small medical team came up the stairs and into the cabin to find a patient stabilized, intubated by hand, his airway held open through 2 waves of anaphylaxis and a transatlantic descent by a woman in a gray sweater who handed them off the way she had once handed off patients in a tent, fast and clean and complete. 71-year-old male, anaphylaxis to peanut, 2 doses of a pie at these times. Here's the timeline. He's been stable for 6 minutes. Watch for a 3rd wave. He's a fighter, his name is Harlan, and he's going to want to know he didn't miss anything important. The lead paramedic, a young man, took the handoff and the timeline and looked at this woman who had just given him the cleanest field report he had ever received in his life, and he said, "Ma'am, are you medical?" And before Maya could give her usual answer, the answer she always gave, "I'm a nurse, Captain Daniel Reyes," standing at the front of his airplane watching his passengers come back to life, said it for her, loud enough for the cabin to hear, one last time. "She's Colonel Maya Okafor," he said. "She's a flight surgeon, and she just kept that man alive over the Atlantic with what you'd find in a first aid kit. So whatever she tells you to do, son, you do it." The young paramedic looked at Maya, and then, because his service had taught him the same thing Daniel Reyes's had, he came to attention right there in the aisle, and he saluted her, and Maya, finally able to, the patient now in other competent hands, got to her feet, her knees stiff from 2 hours on the floor, and returned it. Crisp. Correct. The first salute she had returned in 7 years. The cabin, which had held itself together for 2 hours, came apart then, in the best way. They applauded. They stood in the rows and applauded a woman in a gray sweater, and she stood in the aisle and let them, not because she wanted it, but because she had learned over a hard life that sometimes you have to let people thank you, because the thanks is for them as much as for you. It is how they put down the fear they have been carrying. So she stood, and she nodded, and she put her hand once against the breast pocket of her shirt, against the small brass coin with the worn down nightingale, and she let the airplane say, "Thank you." It would be easy to end it there, with the applause and the salute and the patient saved. But the people who tell stories like this one badly always end them at the salute, and that is a mistake, because the salute is not the point. The point is what comes after, the quiet part, when the lights come up and the adrenaline drains away, and the real measure of who everyone is gets taken. So stay with me for the last of it. It's the part that matters. They held the flight on the ground for 90 minutes, while Harlan Mercer was taken to the small hospital on the island and stabilized for good. He lived. I'll tell you that now, so you don't have to carry it. He lived. He woke up the next morning in a clean bed with a view of gray water and a nurse, a real one, an island nurse with 40 years on her, holding his wrist, and the first thing he asked was whether the woman from the airplane was all right, and the second thing he asked was whether he had missed the meal service, and when they told him yes to the first and laughed at the second, he started to cry, the way old men cry, quietly and without apology, because he had flown home to bury his brother and had nearly gone to join him, and a stranger in a gray sweater had refused to allow it. Maya went to see him before the flight continued on. She sat on the edge of his bed, and he gripped her hand the way he had gripped her sleeve in the aisle, and he said, "They told me what you are. The captain told me." His eyes were wet. "A colonel, a surgeon, and you spent 2 hours on a dirty floor breathing for an old fool who ate the wrong chicken." "You're not a fool, Harlan," she said. "You're a man who was hungry on an airplane. It could happen to anyone. The fool was the one who waited 4 minutes to believe me, and he knows it now, and he's going to be a better doctor for it. So some good came out of your bad chicken? That's not nothing." He laughed, and then he sobered, and he asked the question people always asked her, the one she never liked to answer. "Why didn't you tell him at the start? Why didn't you just say who you were?" And Maya Okafor was quiet for a moment, turning the brass coin over in her fingers, the nightingale catching the gray light from the window. "Because the day I have to say my rank to get someone to let me save a life," she said, "is the day the rank stopped being worth anything. The work is supposed to speak. If I have to announce myself before the work has spoken, then I'm no better than the man who announced himself and was wrong. I'd rather be right and quiet than loud and wrong. I've been on both sides of that, Harlan. Quiet and right is better. It just takes longer to get the salute." She smiled. "And the salute was never the point anyway." She put the coin back in her pocket. She squeezed his hand, and she left him there with his gray water and his second chance, and she never saw him again, though he sent a card every year for the rest of his life to an address the captain helped him find, and every card said the same 2 words at the bottom, and the 2 words were, "Thank you," and she kept everyone. As for Preston Vance, he found her in the small terminal of the island airfield while the airplane was being ready to continue. She was standing by a window with a paper cup of bad coffee, watching the rain come in off the ocean, and he came and stood a careful distance away, a man who had learned in the last few hours the value of a careful distance. "Colonel Okafor," he said. He said it carefully, like a word he was determined to get right from now on. "I won't take much of your time. I needed to say it properly. Not, 'I'm sorry.' That's too small, and it's too much about me." He stopped. Started again. I have been a doctor for 31 years. I have not been corrected, really corrected, corrected and made to feel it in 15 of them. I had forgotten that I could be wrong. You reminded me. You reminded me in the most expensive way there is, with a man's life as the cost, and you did it without once being cruel to me, which I did not deserve. I called you just a nurse. I'd like to spend the rest of my career making sure I never say those words to anyone again. That's all. That's what I came to say. Maya looked at him for a while over the rim of her coffee. Then she nodded slowly. You were a good doctor in that aisle, she said. When you finally listened, your hands knew what to do once your pride got out of their way. That's worth something. A lot of people never get their pride out of the way at all. She turned back to the window. I'll tell you the same thing I told Harlan. The fool isn't the man who's wrong. Everybody's wrong. I've been wrong, badly, with worse stakes than tonight, and I've carried those ones every day since, and I always will. The fool is the man who can't hear that he's wrong because he's too in love with being the doctor. You heard it tonight. Late, but you heard it. So go be a doctor who can hear. That's the whole job, Vance. That was always the whole job. She did not offer him her hand, and he did not expect her to, and that was its own kind of honesty between them. He nodded, and he stepped back, and he carried what she'd said off the island and into the rest of his life, and he was, by every account, a different doctor afterward, a quieter one, a listening one who learned the names of his nurses and asked them before every hard call what they thought and looked again when they told him to look again. He never wrote another book. He said, once, to a resident who stayed late the way he used to, that the most important thing that ever happened to his medicine happened at 38,000 feet, from a woman in a gray sweater, and that he hoped the resident would be lucky enough to be corrected like that someday, and humble enough to let it change him. The resident didn't understand. Vance told him he would, in time. Everyone does in time if they're lucky. Captain Daniel Reyes flew the rest of the leg himself, though he didn't have to, and when the airplane finally landed at its destination 11 hours late, he stood at the door and thanked every passenger as they left, the way captains do. But he held the colonel for last. They stood in the empty jet bridge, the two of them, the cleaning crew already moving through the cabin behind them, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because some things are too large for the middle of a conversation and have to wait for the end of one. 7 years, Reyes said finally. 7 years, Maya agreed. I heard you got out. I didn't know what happened to you after. I went where they needed nurses, she said. Hospitals, clinics. I didn't want the rank anymore, Danny. I'd seen what it does to people who love it too much. I just wanted to do the work. So I do the work, and I don't tell anyone what I was, and most days nobody ever finds out, and that's exactly how I want it. She looked at him. And then, once in a great while, my old pilot turns out to be flying my airplane, and he goes and tells the whole cabin, and I have to be a colonel again for an afternoon. But she was smiling when she said it. I'd salute you again, Reyes said. Right now, in this jet bridge. I'd do it every day if you'd let me. I know you would. That's why I'd never let you. She put out her hand and he took it, and they stood there a moment, two people who had once kept a man alive over a different ocean and had just done it again over this one, and who understood, in the way that only people like them can, that the salute had never been about rank at all. It had been about recognition, the recognition of one person who has carried the weight by another who knows exactly what it weighs. Take care of yourself, Colonel, he said. Maya, she corrected him gently. On the ground, it's Maya. Maya? He nodded. Take care of yourself, Maya. And she picked up her one small bag, and she walked off the airplane and back into the ordinary world, where nobody knew what she was, and nobody saluted her, and she liked it that way, a woman in a gray sweater with a worn brass coin in her breast pocket, and the people who passed her in the terminal saw nothing remarkable at all, which is exactly what she had spent her whole life arranging and exactly what made her remarkable. There is an epilogue, and you've earned it, so here it is. 3 months later, in a city hospital a long way from any ocean, a young nurse named Priya was having the worst shift of her short career. A patient had crashed, and a senior physician had snapped at her in front of the whole unit. Just do what you're told. You're a nurse, not a doctor. And she had gone into the supply room afterward and stood among the boxes of gloves and gauze and tried not to cry, because she had been right about the patient and he had been wrong, and she didn't have the standing to say so, and she was beginning to wonder whether she had chosen the wrong life. And an older nurse found her there, a new hire, quiet, brown skin, cropped gray threaded hair, a plain manner, the kind of nurse who'd been around and didn't say much. She had started on the unit 2 weeks before. Nobody knew much about her. She was good. Everyone said she was good, unnervingly good, the kind of good that made the residents nervous. But she kept to herself. She didn't say anything sympathetic. She didn't say it gets better. She just leaned against the boxes next to Priya and was quiet for a while. And then she took something out of the breast pocket of her scrubs and turned it over in her fingers. A little worn brass coin with a bird stamped on one face, half rubbed away, and she said, "You were right about the potassium. I saw the chart. You were right, and he was wrong, and he knew it, which is why he yelled. People only pull rank when they've lost the argument on the merits." She let that sit. Here's the thing nobody tells you in school. The title isn't the truth. The loudest person in the room isn't the one who's right. And being right and quiet is harder than being loud and wrong, and it takes longer to get any credit for it. And some days you get no credit at all. She closed her hand around the coin. But the patient lives either way, and that was always the point. The credit was never the point. Priya wiped her face. "How do you know all that?" The older nurse smiled a little and put the coin back in her pocket. "Long story," she said. "I had a good teacher once, a few of them actually, and one very bad one, who taught me the most of all by being wrong at the top of his voice when it mattered most." She pushed off the boxes. "Come on, your patient needs his potassium, and you need to go be right out loud for once. I'll back you. That's what the quiet ones are for. We back each other." She paused at the door. "And someday you'll be the quiet one in the supply room, and there'll be a frightened kid who was right and got yelled at, and you'll do this for her. That's how it works. That's the only way it ever works." And she held the door, and Priya walked through it and went back out onto the floor to be right out loud, with someone standing behind her who knew exactly what that cost and exactly what it was worth. Nobody on that unit ever learned that the quiet new nurse had once been a colonel. She never told them. The coin stayed in her pocket, the nightingale wearing a little smoother every year under her thumb, and she did the work, and she let the work speak, and once in a great while, on the worst shifts in the supply rooms with the frightened kids who'd been right and dismissed, she passed the lesson on, the way it had been passed to her, in a tent that smelled of canvas and antiseptic, by a man with a gravel voice who pressed a blank-faced coin into her palm and said, "We don't put the words on it. You already know the words." She did know the words. She had spent a whole life proving them, quietly, to people who underestimated her, and then watching the moment turn over when they finally understood. And if you ever find yourself on an airplane, or in a hospital, or anywhere at all, and someone tells a quiet, competent person to sit down because they're just something, just a nurse, just an assistant, just the help, watch carefully. Watch what happens next, because you may be about to see the same thing 300 people saw at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic, that the people we are quickest to dismiss are very often the ones holding our lives in their steady, unshaking, unremarkable hands, and that the highest rank in any room is not the one on the shoulder. It's the one earned, quietly by the person who was right when it counted and kind about it after and never once needed you to know. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they're always worth the salute. If this one stood you at attention, stay for the next and tell me in the comments who's the quiet one in your life you'd stand up for. I'll be reading every single answer.